Day 1, 6:47 p.m. A $4,000 fine, 10 days to comply. A federal code cited word for word, except it wasn't real. Maren Kowalski stood in her driveway holding the notice, reading the cited section for the third time, waiting for it to say something different. It didn't. The notice was zip-tied to her mailbox, the same cast-iron box her father had built with his own hands the summer he retired after 41 years as a mail carrier. The last thing they'd built together before his stroke. Willowbrook Estates, HOA, Notice of Violation, Cumulative Fine, $4,000.00. Remove within 10 days or face lien proceedings. Her hands weren't shaking from anger. They were shaking because she recognized the misquoted language instantly, the kind of mistake only someone who'd never read the actual code could make. What nobody in this neighborhood knew, Maren had spent 14 years enforcing that exact code for the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. Her phone buzzed. Tom. Dale says he's not backing down this time. Maren looked at the fine, then the mailbox. They picked the wrong mailbox to fine. Willowbrook Estates was the kind of place people moved to for the quiet, manicured lawns, matching shutters, a cul-de-sac where the loudest sound most evenings was a sprinkler system ticking on at 6. Maren and Tom had lived there 5 years, long enough to know which neighbors waved and which just nodded. Maren liked it that way. At work, she carried a badge that opened doors most people didn't know existed. At home, she was just the friendly woman at the end of the street who kept to herself, brought in Ruth Alvarez's trash cans when she forgot, and never once mentioned what she actually did for a living. Tom preferred it that way too. Pick your battles, he liked to say, especially when it came to the HOA. He wasn't wrong, usually. But this wasn't a battle over paint color or grass height. This was her father's hands, sanded into that ironwork. Erase the mailbox, and something of him went with it. She didn't know yet that Dale Preston had done this before, quietly, patiently, to homeowners who never fought back. Dale Preston knocked on the door himself the next morning, which Maren would later realize was its own kind of message. He wanted to see her face when he explained the fine, wanted the small satisfaction of delivering bad news in person. He was holding a clipboard like it was a badge of office, dressed in the kind of pressed golf polo that made him look perpetually on his way to a meeting, even standing on her porch at 9 a.m. on a Saturday. Mrs. Kowalski, he said her name like he was checking it off something. I figured I'd stop by myself, save you a phone call. That's considerate of you. Maren leaned against the doorframe, arms loosely crossed. Not defensive, just watching. It's about the mailbox. He glanced past her shoulder toward the driveway, like the offending object might have grown legs. Section 4.2 of the Community Code, Mailbox Uniformity Standard. All structures are required to match the approved Willowbrook design template. Yours is... He made a small gesture, searching for a word that wouldn't sound as insulting as he meant it. Non-conforming. It's cast iron. It's been there 5 years. Grandfather clauses don't apply retroactively once a violation's been flagged. Dale said this smoothly, the way a man says something he's said many times before. I know it seems like a small thing, but small things matter here. Property values in Willowbrook are some of the highest in the county, and that doesn't happen by accident. It happens because people take pride in maintaining a certain standard. Maren said nothing. She'd interviewed enough people who over-explained a lie to recognize the rhythm of it. I'm not saying you and Tom haven't been good neighbors, Dale went on, filling the silence himself, which people like him always did. But we do have expectations here, a certain level of consistency. I'd hate for this to become a bigger issue than it needs to be. Section 4.2, Maren repeated. Can I see it? The actual recorded language, not the summary in the notice. Something flickered behind Dale's eyes. Small, almost nothing, gone in half a second. It's currently under attorney review. Standard practice when we update code language. Update, Maren said. So it's been amended recently. Housekeeping mostly, clarifying existing standards. Dale shifted his clipboard to his other arm. You know, the Hendersons actually went through something similar last year. Decorative postbox, bit unusual. And once they worked with the board, we found a variance that suited everybody. I'd be happy to walk you through that kind of process if you're interested in resolving this the easy way. The easy way. Marin filed that phrase away carefully, the way she'd file away anything a subject said that revealed more than they meant to. "I'd like the recorded document," she said. "The actual CC&R amendment, with the filing date and the vote record. Not a summary. Not from your attorney's inbox. The one filed with the county." Dale's smile stayed in place, but it cooled by several degrees. "That's not really how these things work, Mrs. Kowalski. The board handles code enforcement. Homeowners don't typically request underlying legal documentation for standard violations." "I'm not a typical homeowner." She said it lightly, almost conversationally, and watched it land somewhere behind his eyes without explanation. "I'll be filing a formal records request with the county recorder's office, just so we're both looking at the same document." For a moment, something almost like irritation crossed his face, quickly folded back into condescension, which she suspected was his default setting when he felt cornered. "Good luck with that," he said, and there was an edge underneath the politeness now, thin but audible. "These things take time. Meanwhile, the 10-day clock is still running." He tapped his clipboard once, like a gavel. "I'd hate for a simple mailbox to turn into a lien situation, Mrs. Kowalski. That gets messy for everyone." He left the way he'd arrived, brisk, certain, a man who had never once been told no and meant it. Marin watched him walk back down the driveway, past the mailbox, without so much as glancing at it. That night, after Tom had gone to bed, still muttering that maybe they should just repaint the thing and call it done, Marin sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open to the county recorder's public portal. She searched Willowbrook Estates' recorded Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, the real one, the one filed decades ago and amended exactly twice, both times with proper notarized signatures and recording stamps. She read it twice. Then a third time, slower. There was no Section 4.2. There was no mailbox uniformity standard at all. Nothing about structures, materials, or design templates for mail receptacles anywhere in the recorded document. The numbering in the real CC&Rs didn't even reach 4.2. Article 4 ended at 4.1, a paragraph about fence height. Marin sat back in her chair, the glow of the laptop screen the only light in the kitchen, and felt the same steady, focused calm she felt at the start of every real investigation. The moment when a case stopped being a feeling and became a fact. Dale Preston had invented a rule, and he'd fined at least one person, her, for breaking it. The HOA's website listed office hours for the board secretary as by appointment, which turned out to mean Lucia Fenn worked out of her dining room 3 mornings a week, surrounded by filing boxes and a laptop that looked older than the neighborhood's oldest oak tree. Marin called ahead, kept her voice easy and unremarkable, a homeowner with a paperwork question, nothing more, and Lucia agreed to meet Tuesday morning. Lucia was younger than Marin expected, maybe mid-30s, with the tired, overly careful politeness of someone used to being caught in the middle of things. She opened the door only partway at first, like she was deciding whether to let the conversation happen at all. "I got your message about the meeting minutes," Lucia said, before Marin had even finished a greeting. "And the amendment history, that's a bigger request than usual. I just want to see the record of when Section 4.2 was adopted, the vote, the date, whoever proposed it." Marin kept her tone light, curious rather than accusatory. "Should be a quick pull, if it's official." Something moved behind Lucia's expression, quick, involuntary, gone almost as fast as it appeared. "The thing is," she said slowly, "not everything gets voted on the way it's supposed to. Sometimes Dale says something's board approved, and by the time anyone asks questions, it's already been enforced for months." She said it quietly, almost like she hadn't meant to say it out loud, and then immediately backpedaled. "I'm not saying anything's wrong. The minutes might not reflect everything. Not perfectly." "Can I still see them?" Marin asked. "Whatever exists, even incomplete." Lucia hesitated a long moment, glancing back over her shoulder into the house, as if Dale himself might be standing somewhere behind her. Then she nodded, just once, and disappeared inside, returning a few minutes later with a thin folder. "This is what I have printed," she said. "For the last 2 years. I can't promise it's everything." It wasn't everything, but it was enough. Marin spent the following 2 evenings at the kitchen table, minutes and fine notices spread out in careful rows like evidence boards she'd built 100 times before for actual federal cases, except this one was smaller, pettier, and somehow angrier for it. The pattern took shape fast, the way patterns did once you stopped assuming good faith. 4 other homeowners besides Marin had been fined under Section 4.2 over the past 18 months. Ruth Alvarez, 2 doors down, an elderly widow who'd paid $300 over a ceramic garden gnome mounted to her mailbox post, some kind of decorative flourish the notice called unauthorized ornamentation. A young couple on Larkspur Court, fined for a mailbox repainted a shade of green that wasn't on an approved list nobody could produce. An older man near the entrance, fined for reinforcing his post after a storm knocked it sideways. All 4 were quiet homeowners. None of them, as far as Marin could tell from the minutes, had ever pushed back publicly on anything the board did. Meanwhile, 3 homes, all belonging to people Marin recognized from board meeting sign-in sheets, people who sat near Dale at community events, people whose names came up warmly in the minutes when discussing volunteer opportunities, had mailboxes that were, if anything, more elaborate than Marin's. One had a custom brick base. One had hand-painted address numbers in a font that definitely wasn't the approved template. None of them had received so much as a warning. Marin sat back and looked at the pattern laid out in front of her, and felt something cold and clear settle into place. This wasn't overzealous rule enforcement. This was a rule invented specifically to be applied selectively, a lever, not a law. Tom found her still at the table past 11, papers fanned out under the kitchen light, and something in his face told her he'd been building up to this conversation for a few days. "Mare," he said it gently, sitting down across from her. "I get why you're angry. I am too. But I keep thinking about how this ends if you push it all the way. Dale's the kind of guy who doesn't just fold when he's caught. He digs in. What if he starts going after the shed or the fence, or finds some other thing to fine us for out of spite? What if this turns into a 2-year fight over a mailbox?" "It's not about the mailbox," Marin said, quieter than she meant to. "I know that." Tom reached across the table, covered her hand with his. "I know what it means to you. I just don't want it to cost us more than it's worth." Marin looked down at the folder of fine notices, at Ruth Alvarez's name typed in the same cold, formal font as her own. "He built a fake rule," she said, "and used it to bully a widow over a garden gnome. And I'm supposed to let that go because it might be inconvenient to fight it?" She shook her head slowly. "Dad spent 41 years making sure people's mail got where it was supposed to go, no matter how small the address, no matter who lived there. He believed rules were supposed to protect people equally, or they weren't worth anything at all." She met Tom's eyes. "I'm not caving to a rule that doesn't exist, not for $4,000, and not because Dale Preston thinks a badge and a clipboard make him untouchable." Tom didn't argue further. He just nodded, slow and resigned, the particular nod of a man who'd been married long enough to know when a decision had already been made. The retaliation, when it came, wasn't loud. It came through the neighborhood group chat, the same one used for lost cat alerts and reminders about trash pickup schedules, where Dale posted a message that never used Marin's name directly, but didn't need to. "Just a reminder, neighbors, that our HOA works best when everyone approaches disagreements as a team. Lately, we've had a homeowner escalating a routine compliance matter in ways that aren't in the spirit of community cooperation. I'd hate for one person's difficulty accepting feedback to affect the tone of our whole neighborhood. Let's keep Willowbrook the welcoming place we all signed up for." It took less than an hour for 2 neighbors who used to wave every morning to stop waving altogether. Marin read the message twice, feeling the particular, practiced sting of being quietly reframed as the problem by someone who was, provably, lying. It was a tactic she recognized from a dozen fraud cases. Isolate the person asking questions before they can be heard by anyone else. It didn't work the way Dale intended. 2 days later, Marin sat down and filed a formal complaint with the county's HOA Oversight Office, citing the fabricated code section, the selective enforcement pattern across 5 homeowners, and requesting an independent review of Willowbrook Estate's recorded governing documents against its actual enforcement practices. She attached copies of every fine notice she'd gathered, including Ruth's. She hit submit just after 10 that night, and for the first time since the yellow notice appeared on her mailbox, she felt something other than anger. She felt like a case had finally, properly, begun. The certified letter arrived 6 days after Marin filed her county complaint, which she suspected was not a coincidence. She signed for it on the porch, still in her work clothes, and read it standing in the doorway. It was longer than the first notice, denser with legal-sounding phrases, and it escalated the original fine into something with teeth. Failure to remit payment within the specified compliance window may result in the filing of a lien against the property, in accordance with Willowbrook Estates governing documents. The same phantom section was cited twice more. 3 days after that, a white sedan with a magnetic Willowbrook Estates HOA door decal pulled into her driveway unannounced, and a man Maren didn't recognize walked her fence line with a clipboard of his own, photographing the height of her back fence, the edging around her garden beds, and, she watched through the kitchen window, arms crossed, the trim color on her shutters, comparing it to a paint swatch card he held up against the wood like he was matching lipstick. "Routine compliance sweep," he told her when she came outside, not quite meeting her eyes. "Board requested a full property review." "A full review," Maren repeated. "For me specifically." "Just following the list I was given, ma'am." She didn't need him to say Dale's name. She already knew. The neighborhood spring social happened that Saturday, an annual event with a taco truck and a bounce house that Maren normally enjoyed, and which she now walked into like she was entering hostile territory, because, increasingly, she was. She caught it in fragments, the way rumors always traveled. A pause in conversation when she approached a cluster of neighbors near the drink table. A too bright, "Oh, hey, Maren," from a woman who usually just waved. Later, Ruth Alvarez pulled her aside near the dessert table, voice low. "Dale's been telling people you're hiding something," Ruth said. "That you're cagey about your job, and if you've got nothing to hide from the board, why won't you just be upfront about what you actually do for a living?" Maren felt something settle cold and precise in her chest. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. It was a classic pressure tactic, the kind she'd seen used against witnesses a dozen times. Manufacture suspicion where there was none. Make privacy look like guilt. "He's fishing," Maren said quietly. "I think he is," Ruth agreed. Then, after a pause, something shifted in the older woman's face. A kind of resolve settling into features that had looked tired and careful for as long as Maren had known her. "Can I tell you something? About the gnome fine?" Maren nodded, said nothing, let the silence do the work it always did. "It wasn't really about the gnome," Ruth said. "It was a little ceramic thing my husband gave me the year before he passed. Dale said it violated ornamentation standards. I paid the fine in 4 days flat because I was scared of what would happen if I didn't, scared of a lien, scared of some big fight I didn't have the energy for at 71. She looked down at her hands. "I've regretted it every year since. Watching you not back down, I don't know. It's made me think maybe I should have fought harder." "It's not too late," Maren said. Ruth met her eyes, and something passed between them that felt, for the first time, like the beginning of an alliance instead of a private grievance. That night, Maren spread the case out across the kitchen table again, this time with a legal pad and a growing certainty that she was no longer building a personal defense, she was building a pattern of conduct file, the kind she'd assembled 100 times for actual investigations. She cross-referenced dates. The earliest fine under Section 4.2 was issued to Ruth Alvarez nearly 4 years ago. But the meeting minutes Lucia had given her showed no vote, no motion, no mention of a mailbox uniformity standard at any board meeting in that window. Not once, in 4 years, had it ever come up for discussion in an official capacity. Which meant Dale hadn't just failed to hold a vote. He'd been enforcing a rule that had never existed at all, for years, quietly, on people unlikely to check. She texted Lucia a single, careful question. Was there ever a closed-door board session where mailbox standards came up, even informally? Lucia's reply came almost an hour later, hesitant, clearly typed and deleted more than once before being sent. "There were a few things Dale said were handled outside regular meetings. I always assumed that meant attorney stuff. I don't actually know anymore. I'm sorry, I should have asked more questions a long time ago." Maren saved the message like she'd save any piece of evidence. Not because Lucia had confessed to anything, but because the crack was widening, and cracks, in Maren's experience, only widened one direction. She didn't expect to run into Dale that evening, but he was waiting by her mailbox when she came out to get the trash bins, standing a little too close to the post her father had built, hands in his pockets, none of the performative politeness left in his posture at all. "Filing a county complaint," Dale said, without preamble. That was a bold move. It was an accurate one. Marin kept her voice level. "You understand how these things actually work, right?" He took a step closer, voice dropping into something quieter and uglier than his usual clipboard and polo persona. "I've been on this board for 9 years. I know people at the county level. Friends who sit on the oversight committee you just filed with. Complaints like yours have a funny way of losing momentum once the right person takes a look at them." It was meant to frighten her. Marin understood exactly what it was, watching him say it. A threat dressed up as friendly advice. The same tactic she'd heard a dozen small-time fraudsters use right before they realized the person across from them wasn't who they assumed. She let the silence stretch a beat longer than was comfortable, watching something flicker behind Dale's confidence, before she answered. "You should probably know," Marin said, evenly, almost gently, "that I deal with a lot of people who think they know how a paper trail works. Most of them are wrong about how thin the ice actually is." She glanced deliberately at the mailbox beside them. "And I'd be careful, Dale, about threatening someone over federal mail receptacle interference. That's a very specific kind of mistake to make." She didn't say her job title. She didn't need to. For the first time since the yellow notice appeared on her mailbox, Dale Preston said nothing at all, and for just a moment, standing in the fading evening light, something like uncertainty crossed his face, before he turned and walked back toward his house, faster than he'd arrived. Monday morning, Marin walked into her own office building for the first time in this entire ordeal, thinking of it not as her workplace, but as a resource, which was, she realized, exactly the moment the case stopped being personal and started being procedural. She found Grant Diaz, her supervisor, in his office before the morning briefing and closed the door behind her. "I need to file something," she said, "and I need you to tell me honestly whether I'm seeing this correctly, because I'm too close to it to trust my own read." She laid it out plainly. The zip-tied notice on a residential mail receptacle, the fine tied to a fabricated HOA rule, the pattern of selective enforcement, and front, the part she suspected actually mattered most from a jurisdictional standpoint. The fact that the original notice had been physically attached directly to her mailbox, a federally designated postal receptacle, in a manner that could be read as obstructing or interfering with its function. Grant listened without interrupting, the way he always did, and when she finished, he leaned back in his chair for a long moment. "You know as well as I do," he said finally, "that tampering with a mail receptacle isn't a local HOA matter once it crosses into obstruction. That's federal, full stop, regardless of who's doing it or why." He tapped a pen against his desk. "You should have brought this to me the first week." "I know. You're too close to it." "I know that too." Marin met his eyes. "Which is why I'm bringing it to you now, formally, through the compliance channel, instead of handling it myself. I want this documented properly. I want it to hold up regardless of what happens with the HOA side." Grant studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Then let's do it right." By the end of the day, Marin had filed an internal disclosure, identifying herself as a directly affected party, requesting that any investigation into the mail receptacle interference be handled by a colleague rather than herself, to avoid any appearance of conflict. It was the correct move, the careful move, the kind of move that made a case bulletproof instead of personal. It also meant that, for the first time, Willowbrook Estates' HOA board was now, officially, the subject of a federal inquiry, even if none of them knew it yet. The county records office called her back 2 days later, a clerk with a flat, unbothered voice reading off exactly what Marin had already begun to suspect. "I'm not finding any amendment matching what you've described," the clerk said. "The Declaration of Covenants for Willowbrook Estates was recorded in 1998, amended once in 2006 and once in 2014. Nothing filed since. Nothing referencing mailbox standards at all." "So Section 4.2 was never legally adopted," Marin said, mostly to confirm it out loud. "Not through this office, no ma'am. If your HOA's been enforcing it, it's not tied to anything on record here." Marin thanked her, hung up, and sat with the confirmation for a long moment, not surprised exactly, but struck by the weight of having it stated so plainly by someone with no stake in the outcome at all. A fabricated rule, enforced selectively, for years. The only remaining question was why. She found the answer, indirectly, through property records, the same public search tools she used constantly for work, turned now toward her own neighborhood. 3 of the 5 homeowners fined under Section 4.2, including Ruth Alvarez, had received unsolicited purchase offers within the past year from a company called Larkwood Residential Partners. The offers were modest, slightly under market value, framed as friendly cash buyouts from a company that specialized in helping homeowners transition smoothly. Larkwood Residential Partners was registered to a man named Curtis Fenn. Marin stared at the name for a long moment before it clicked. She checked the county's marriage records out of habit born from 100 prior cases and found what she suspected she would. Curtis Fenn was Dale Preston's brother-in-law. It wasn't proof of coordination, not yet. But it was a motive-shaped hole in the story that had been missing until now. Fines weren't just about control or ego. They were pressure. A slow, deniable squeeze meant to make certain homeowners tired enough, scared enough, or financially strained enough to accept a quiet buyout instead of fighting a fabricated fine. Ruth Alvarez had nearly sold 2 years ago, she'd mentioned once, almost offhand, at the spring social. Marin hadn't understood the significance of it at the time. She understood it now. The knock on her door that evening was quieter than Dale's had been, almost apologetic. Lucia Fenn stood on the porch holding a thick manila envelope against her chest, like it might try to escape. "I need to give you something," Lucia said, before Marin could even invite her in. "And I need you to know I should have done this a long time ago." Inside the envelope were the real board minutes, unedited, unsummarized, going back nearly 5 years, along with a handful of internal emails Lucia had quietly kept archived, the kind of paper trail a careful, uneasy person kept without fully admitting to herself why. Dale added Section 4.2 into the enforcement guidelines himself, Lucia said. There was never a vote. I remember him telling me it was basically already approved in spirit after a board dinner, and I just went along with it, because I didn't know what else to do. I've been sitting on this for years, telling myself it wasn't my place to say anything. She looked down. But watching what he's done to you, and to Ruth, I can't keep pretending I didn't know. Marin took the envelope carefully, the way she'd take evidence in any real case, with the specific, focused calm that came from finally holding proof instead of suspicion. "Thank you," she said quietly. "This took courage." Lucia gave a small, tired laugh. "It took longer than it should have." That night, Marin laid everything out across the kitchen table one final time, and for the first time in weeks, the picture in front of her was complete instead of fragmented. She had proof the rule was fabricated, sourced directly from the county recorder. She had proof of selective enforcement, 5 homeowners fined under a phantom section, while 3 board-connected properties went untouched. She had a financial motive, tenuous but real, tying the fines to pressure toward Dale's own family. And she had federal jurisdiction over the piece that made this more than a neighborhood dispute, the physical interference with a postal receptacle, now formally logged through her own agency's compliance channel. 4 pieces. One clear line connecting all of them. She thought of her father, of the mailbox he'd built with his own hands, of the quiet dignity he'd always insisted the smallest rules were supposed to protect, not weaponize. Then she opened her laptop, found the HOA's public meeting calendar, and confirmed the date of the next open board session, the one required by the association's actual, legally recorded bylaws to be open to all homeowners. She composed a short, formal email to the board, requesting to be added to the agenda for public comment, and copied Lucia Fenn as the recording secretary. The whole neighborhood would be there. For the first time since the yellow notice appeared on her mailbox, Marin wasn't dreading the next confrontation. She was ready for it. The community hall smelled like it always did during HOA meetings, burnt coffee and the particular staleness of folding chairs that only came out a handful of times a year. Tonight, though, every chair was full, and more people stood along the back wall than Marin had ever seen at a Willowbrook meeting in 5 years of quietly skipping most of them. Word traveled fast in a cul-de-sac. It traveled faster when the word was confrontation. Dale stood at the front with his usual clipboard, but Marin noticed, for the first time, a faint tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there during their first conversation on her porch. He opened the meeting quickly, almost too quickly, moving through the minutes and treasurer's report with none of his usual performative warmth, clearly hoping to bury the moment he knew was coming somewhere in procedural noise. He didn't bury it long. Before we move to new business, Dale said, folding his hands atop the podium, I want to address something directly, because I know it's been on people's minds. He let his gaze sweep the room, landing, deliberately, on Marin. Over the past several weeks, one homeowner has escalated what began as a routine compliance matter into something far larger than it needed to be, filing county complaints, refusing simple fine resolutions, involving outside agencies. I understand disagreements happen, but I think it's fair to say that some people here have had a harder time simply following the rules the rest of us agreed to respect. A few heads nodded automatically, out of habit more than conviction. Marin recognized the tactic even as it unfolded: frame the fight before the other side can speak, make compliance sound like community virtue, and resistance sound like ego. She stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room was already quiet, already leaning in. I have one question, Marin said, and I'd like an honest answer, if anyone in this room can give me one. She let the pause sit a beat longer than was comfortable. Can anyone here show me where Section 4.2, the Mailbox Uniformity Standard, was ever actually voted on? Silence. It wasn't the silence of people thinking. It was the silence of people realizing they didn't have an answer and weren't sure they wanted to know why. Dale opened his mouth to answer, something practiced and smooth clearly forming, but Marin wasn't finished. Not summarized, she continued, not referenced informally, voted on, recorded, filed with the county, the way every other amendment to this community's actual governing documents has been, going back to 1998. She looked around the room, slow and deliberate, meeting eyes instead of avoiding them. Because I've checked. The county recorder has no record of it, at all. The silence shifted texture, thickened. Dale's composure held for another moment. Barely. Section 4.2 was adopted through standard board procedure, he said, and I don't think this is the appropriate venue to relitigate. Lucia. Marin said the name gently, not as a demand, and turned toward the recording secretary's table at the side of the room. Every head in the hall turned with her. Lucia sat very still for a long moment, hands folded tightly in her lap, clearly caught in the particular paralysis of someone who has spent a long time being quiet and is suddenly aware that the silence has run out of road. There wasn't a vote, Lucia said finally, her voice smaller than usual but steady. I have the actual minutes. Section 4.2 was never on an agenda. Dale told me it was handled outside the regular meetings, and I recorded it as adopted because he told me it was, and She stopped, swallowed. I should have asked more questions, I'm sorry, but it wasn't voted on, not once. A murmur moved through the crowd, low and unsettled, the sound of a room recalibrating in real time. Dale's jaw tightened. Lucia, I think you're misremembering the process. I have the emails, Dale. Lucia's voice found more steel than Marin had heard from her yet. I kept them. I don't think I'm misremembering anything. Ruth Alvarez stood before Dale could regain the floor, and something about the older woman's posture, spine a little straighter than Marin had ever seen it, silenced the room again almost instantly. I paid a $300 fine 4 years ago, Ruth said, voice trembling slightly but not stopping, because Dale told me a ceramic gnome my late husband gave me violated ornamentation standards under this same section. I never saw the rule written down. I never got to see a vote. I paid because I was 71 and scared of a lien on the only home I had left of him. She looked at Dale directly. I want to know why nobody else's mailbox got fined for things far more decorated than mine. Before Dale could answer, a man near the back, the homeowner from Larkspur Court, Marin realized, whose family had been fined over paint color, stood as well. Same thing happened to us, he said. $200 fine for a mailbox color nobody could show us on an approved list. We paid because we didn't want the hassle. A third voice followed, an older man near the entrance describing the fine over his storm-damaged post, reinforced without a permit he was never told he needed. The room had shifted from murmuring to something sharper, not quite anger yet, but the early edges of it, aimed now squarely at the podium. Dale's composure cracked for the first time visibly, a flush climbing up his neck. This is exactly the kind of pile-on that happens when people decide to make a personal grievance into theater, he said, louder now, reaching for authority instead of earning it. Mrs. Kowalski has clearly made this into a personal vendetta against me and this board, and frankly, I think we should be asking why she's so determined to undermine. Because it's my job to notice patterns like this, Marin said, calm and even, cutting cleanly through his momentum without raising her voice at all. The room went quiet again, differently this time, curious now, not just uneasy. "I'm a United States Postal Inspector," Marin continued, and reached into her bag, producing her federal credentials, holding them up not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact, the way she might present them at any scene that required clarity instead of confusion. "I investigate mail fraud and interference with postal receptacles for a living. When a notice gets zip-tied directly to a federally protected mail receptacle, that's not just an HOA matter anymore. That's something I'm required to report through my own agency, and I have." She let that settle before continuing. "I'm not telling you this to intimidate anyone in this room. I'm telling you because it's true, and because I think everyone here deserves to know exactly what's actually being investigated right now. A fabricated rule, used selectively against homeowners who never fought back, some of whom received purchase offers afterward from a company owned by Dale's own brother-in-law." The murmur that followed wasn't low anymore. Several neighbors who had nodded along automatically at the start of the meeting were now looking at Dale with an expression Marin recognized instantly from 100 interviews. The particular, dawning look of people realizing they'd trusted someone they probably shouldn't have. Dale opened his mouth once, twice, and for the first time since Marin had met him, nothing smooth came out. That is a mischaracterization," he managed finally, but his voice had lost its podium certainty entirely, thin now, defensive in a way that convinced no one in the room. "I think we should table this discussion until—" "I think," said an older man near the front, one of the board members Marin didn't know well, speaking up for the first time all evening. "We should actually see those minutes Lucia mentioned. Tonight." A ripple of agreement moved through the folding chairs. Dale stood at the podium, clipboard suddenly looking less like an instrument of authority and more like something to hide behind, as the room he'd controlled so effortlessly for years began, for the first time, to slip out of his hands. The emergency session was scheduled for the following Thursday, called not by Dale but by the board itself, a fact that told Marin everything she needed to know about how quickly the ground had shifted beneath him. The county's HOA Oversight Office had agreed to send a compliance officer to observe, given the formal complaint already on file. Grant Diaz attended as well, not as Marin's supervisor, but as the designated point of contact for the mail tampering inquiry, seated near the back with a slim folder of his own. The community hall was fuller than it had been even the week before. Word had spread the way it only spread in a neighborhood that had spent years pretending not to gossip. Dale arrived with an attorney this time, a sharp-suited man named Harmon, who set a leather portfolio down at the front table with the practiced ease of someone used to making problems disappear through procedure. Marin recognized the type. She'd cross-examined enough of them. The county compliance officer, a woman named Patricia Ostrander, opened the session without ceremony. "We're here to review a formal complaint alleging fabrication of a homeowners association rule, selective enforcement of fines under that rule, and related concerns regarding a pattern of financial pressure on affected homeowners. I'll be documenting this session for the county's records." Harmon rose first, smooth and unhurried. "Before we go further, I want to note for the record that informal rulemaking and administrative shorthand are common practice in HOA governance. Boards frequently operate on understood consensus without every procedural step being formally minuted. This is not evidence of wrongdoing. It's evidence of an association trying to function efficiently." "That may be true in some cases," Marin said, standing when Ostrander gestured for her to respond. "But this isn't a case of an informally understood rule. This is a rule that was never adopted at all, formally or informally, by any vote of this board, and was used to fine 5 specific homeowners while leaving comparable or more significant deviations untouched among homeowners connected to the board president." She'd brought everything organized now, the way she organized any case file. Tabs, dates, cross-references, the discipline of 14 years showing in every page. She laid the county recorder's confirmation on the table first. "This is written confirmation from the Willowbrook Estates Recorded Declaration of Covenants, current as of this year. Section 4.2 does not exist. The article in question ends at 4.1. There is no mailbox uniformity standard anywhere in the legally recorded governing documents of this association. Harmon glanced at it, unbothered. Recorded documents can lag behind board-level administrative decisions. That's not unusual. It would be, Marin said, if there were any board-level decision to lag behind. There isn't. Lucia Fenn, the board secretary, has confirmed that Section 4.2 was never placed on a meeting agenda, never voted on, and never formally adopted in any session she recorded. She turned toward Lucia, seated stiffly near the front. Would you confirm that for the record? Lucia stood, visibly nervous but steady in a way she hadn't managed the week before. I would. I have 5 years of minutes, and 4.2 doesn't appear in any of them as an agenda item or a vote. I also have email correspondence where Dale directed me to add it to the enforcement guidelines as, in his words, something we already agreed on. We never did. She handed a folder to Ostrander, who accepted it without comment, flipping through pages with the unhurried thoroughness of someone building an official record rather than reacting to drama. Harmon shifted tactics smoothly. Even granting a procedural irregularity in how the rule was documented, that doesn't establish selective enforcement. Fines were issued to homeowners whose mailboxes deviated from community norms. That's a judgment call within the board's discretion. Then perhaps you can explain, Marin said, why these 3 properties, she slid photographs across the table, printed clean and dated, pulled from the association's own newsletter archive over the past 2 years, each belonging to homeowners with close personal or social ties to the board president, feature mailbox modifications more extensive than any of the 5 fined homeowners, and received no fines, no notices, and no compliance inspections at all. Ostrander studied the photographs for a long moment, then looked up at Dale directly for the first time. Mr. Preston, can you account for that discrepancy? Dale's jaw worked once before he answered. Enforcement priorities shift. We can't inspect every property simultaneously. It's a matter of 4 years, Marin said quietly. Ruth Alvarez was fined over 4 years ago for a small ceramic ornament. These 3 properties have had their current mailbox configurations for at least that long, based on the newsletter archive photos I pulled. 4 years, and not 1 inspection. Ruth stood on her own this time, without being prompted, her voice carrying clearly across the hall. I paid that fine within 4 days because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't. I want to know, on the record, why my grief over my husband's memory was treated as a violation, while people close to Dale never had to explain anything at all. The hall had gone very quiet, the particular quiet of a room watching something come apart in slow motion. Harmon leaned toward Dale and murmured something low. Dale's expression, for the first time all evening, showed something other than practiced composure. A flicker of real strain, quickly smoothed over but not quickly enough for the room to miss it. Ostrander made a note, unhurried, and looked up. I think, she said, it's time we discuss the financial component of this complaint. Dale's hand, resting on the edge of the table, went very still. Ostrander opened a second folder, the county's own, and Marin recognized the particular calm of an official who had already done her homework before walking into the room. Larkwood Residential Partners, Ostrander said, made unsolicited purchase offers to 3 homeowners fined under Section 4.2 within the past 18 months. Ruth Alvarez, the Delgado family on Larkspur Court, and Mr. Whitfield near the entrance. Larkwood Residential Partners is registered to Curtis Fenn. She let the name sit in the air a moment before continuing. Mr. Preston, is Curtis Fenn your brother-in-law? The room's attention swung to Dale like a single held breath. That's a coincidence of timing, Dale said, but the words came out thinner than anything he'd said all evening, the practiced smoothness finally, visibly gone. Curtis runs a legitimate business. Buying distressed or motivated seller properties is completely standard. Motivated, Marin repeated, quiet enough that it landed harder than shouting would have. Motivated by fines that didn't legally exist, issued to homeowners who, by your own admission just now, were more likely to sell because of financial pressure you created. I never told Curtis who to approach, Dale said, too quickly, the kind of denial that answered a question nobody had asked yet. Harmon put a hand briefly on his client's arm, a small, practiced gesture, the universal signal of an attorney trying to stop a man from talking himself further into a hole, but it came a beat too late. Nobody accused you of directing the offers, Mr. Preston, Ostrander said evenly. Until now. Dale's face went through several expressions in quick succession. Indignation, calculation, something that looked almost like panic, before something else broke through underneath all of it, raw in a way none of his previous performances had been. "You have no idea what it takes to hold this community together," he said, voice rising, no longer addressing Ostrander or the board or even Marin specifically, but the room as a whole, like a man making a final appeal to a jury he could feel slipping away. 9 years. 9 years I've kept this place from turning into every other neighborhood where nobody cares, where standards slip, where property values fall because people let things go. I built something here, and nobody has ever thanked me for it. They complain about a fine, they roll their eyes at a warning letter, and they have no idea how much work it takes to keep a place like this from falling apart. His voice cracked slightly, an ugly, exposed sound. So yes, maybe some of the fines were aggressive. Maybe the paperwork wasn't perfect. But everything I did because somebody has to care about this place. And it clearly isn't going to be the people who live here. The silence that followed wasn't the tense, coiled silence of before. It was something flatter, more final, the sound of a room finishing its verdict quietly, without needing to say it aloud. Ruth Alvarez spoke into that silence, gently, almost sadly. "Dale, we did care. You just never let anyone show it in a way that wasn't through a fine." Dale said nothing. For the first time since Marin had met him, he had no answer ready at all. Ostrander closed her folder with a soft, deliberate motion. "Based on what's been presented tonight, the county will be opening a formal review into Willowbrook Estate's governing document compliance and enforcement practices, including the fabricated Section 4.2 and all fines issued under it. Any fines tied to that section will be recommended for nullification pending that review, effective immediately." She looked toward Grant Diaz, seated near the back. "I understand there's a separate federal matter as well." Grant stood briefly. "The mail tampering aspect, attachment of enforcement notices to protected postal receptacles, is being handled separately through the Postal Inspection Service, outside HOA jurisdiction. That inquiry will proceed independently of tonight's outcome." A board member near the front, one of the quieter members who had barely spoken in 5 years of meetings Marin had half attended, cleared his throat and made a motion, voice steadier than Marin had expected. "I move that the board initiate immediate removal proceedings for the board president, pending the outcome of the county review." The second came almost instantly from Lucia. The vote, when it came, was not close. Only one hand besides Dale's own stayed down. Dale sat very still through the count, staring at some fixed point on the table in front of him, the leather portfolio his attorney had set down so confidently at the start of the evening, now closed and untouched. Marin watched him, not with triumph exactly, but with something quieter, the particular unglamorous satisfaction of watching a fabricated thing finally collapse under the simple weight of being untrue. She thought, briefly, of the mailbox waiting at home, still standing exactly where her father had built it. For the first time in weeks, she let herself believe it would stay that way. The letter confirming the nullification of all fines under Section 4.2 arrived on a Tuesday, unremarkable in its envelope, the kind of ordinary mail her father had spent 41 years delivering, without ever imagining his own daughter would one day need it delivered to her. Marin read it standing at the kitchen counter, coffee going lukewarm beside her, and felt something in her chest loosen that she hadn't fully realized had been clenched for weeks. Fine amount, $0. Balance, cleared. She carried the letter outside without quite deciding to, past the porch steps, down the driveway, to where the mailbox stood exactly as it always had, navy blue, a little weathered at the edges now, cast iron holding steady the way her father had built it to hold steady, against weather and time and, apparently, small men with clipboards. She ran her fingers along the top edge of it, the way she used to when she was young enough to be lifted up to see inside. Tom found her there a few minutes later, quiet, holding something small in his hand that he'd clearly been waiting for the right moment to give her. "I had this made last week," he said, a little sheepish, holding out a thin brass plaque, barely larger than a name tag, engraved in simple lettering. "I wasn't sure when to give it to you. Figured now was probably it." Marin took it, and read the words twice before she trusted her voice enough to speak. Built by Robert Kowalski and Maren Kowalski, some things are worth keeping exactly as they are. You didn't have to do this, she said, throat tight. I know, Tom shrugged, the particular understated shrug of a man who rarely said the big things out loud, but had clearly been thinking about them all week. But I watched you fight for 4 months over a mailbox, and it was never really about the mailbox, and I wanted there to be something here that said that plainly, in case anyone ever wondered why you cared so much. Maren knelt down at the base of the post and, with Tom holding it steady, screwed the small plaque into place just below the box itself, where it would catch the morning light without demanding attention. Quiet, permanent, exactly the way her father had lived. She stood back and looked at it for a long moment. It wasn't about the $4,000. It had never been about the money, not for a single day of this. It was about a version of power that worked only in the dark. Quiet fines, invented rules, pressure applied just gently enough that most people simply paid and moved on, rather than ask the one question that unraveled everything. Can anyone show me where this was ever actually voted on? Her father had spent his whole career believing that the smallest rules, followed honestly, were what made trust between neighbors and institutions possible at all. That a letter reached the right mailbox not because someone with power decided it should, but because a system existed that treated every address the same, powerful or not, connected or not. Dale Preston had built something that worked exactly opposite to that. And it had worked, for years, precisely because nobody with anything to lose had ever stood at their mailbox and said no. Maren looked down at the little brass plaque, sunlight catching the engraved letters, and felt something settle into place that was larger than relief. It felt like closure earned honestly, the only kind that ever really held. Ruth Alvarez showed up 2 days later with a plate of lemon bars she insisted were just something small, though she stood on the porch for a full 10 minutes talking before she'd let Maren take the plate from her hands. I wanted to say thank you properly, Ruth said, not just in a hallway at some meeting. She looked toward the mailbox, then back at Maren. I spent 4 years telling myself I didn't fight back because it wasn't worth the trouble. Watching you not back down showed me that wasn't really the reason. The reason was I didn't think anyone would believe me if I did. She reached out and squeezed Maren's hand, brief and firm. You made it so I didn't have to be the only one saying it out loud. Others came in smaller ways over the following weeks, a wave that lingered a beat longer than it used to. A neighbor stopping to say she'd finally reported a fine she'd quietly paid 2 years back. The young couple from Larkspur Court dropping off a bottle of wine with a note that just said, "Thank you for asking the question first." Maren hadn't expected any of it. She'd only ever meant to save one mailbox. The county-mandated special election for board president was held the following month, in the same community hall, though this time the folding chairs felt less like a courtroom and more like what they were always supposed to be, neighbors, gathering to decide something together. Lucia Fenn's name was on the ballot, which surprised exactly no one who'd watched the past 6 weeks unfold, and surprised Lucia herself more than anyone. I never wanted this, she admitted to Maren beforehand, hands twisting nervously in her lap. I liked being the person in the background, taking notes, not making decisions. But I spent 5 years watching things happen that I knew weren't right and telling myself it wasn't my place to say so. I don't want to be that person anymore. She won by a wide margin. Her first act as president wasn't dramatic, just a simple motion, seconded immediately, requiring every proposed rule change to be posted publicly at least 30 days before any vote, along with the vote record itself, permanently archived and accessible to any homeowner who asked. A second motion established a formal appeals process for any fine, reviewed by a rotating panel of 3 homeowners rather than the board president alone. Small changes. Procedural, almost boring, the kind of thing that would never make anyone's heart race the way a confrontation in a packed hall might. But Maren understood, better than most people in that room, that boring procedure was exactly what made power accountable instead of arbitrary. That the difference between a community and a fiefdom often came down to nothing more dramatic than whether a rule had actually been voted on, and whether anyone had bothered to write it down. Dale Preston sold his house in Willowbrook Estates 3 months later, quietly, without a for sale sign lingering long in the yard. Maren heard he'd moved 2 counties over. She felt, when she heard the news, less satisfaction than she expected, mostly just a kind of tired relief, the particular exhaustion that came after a fight finally, fully ended. She stood at her mailbox most evenings now, out of habit more than necessity, running her fingers along the small brass plaque Tom had installed, reading the same 11 words until they'd worn a groove into her memory, as familiar as her father's handwriting. Some things are worth keeping exactly as they are. It wasn't just about the mailbox, she thought, and it never had been. It was about a version of her father that lived on in the small, stubborn insistence that rules should mean something equally for everyone, that quiet people deserved the same protection as loud ones, and that the smallest act of asking, "Can you show me where this was actually voted on?" could, given enough patience, take down something that had stood unquestioned for years. Willowbrook Estates was quieter again in the evenings, sprinklers ticking on at 6, neighbors waving the way they used to. But it was a different kind of quiet now, the kind built on something real, instead of something merely unquestioned. And the mailbox, weathered and sturdy and exactly where it had always stood, caught the last edge of evening light the same way it had every evening for 5 years, holding steady against whatever came next. People asked Marin sometimes if it had really been worth it. 4 months, a county complaint, a federal inquiry, all of it, over a mailbox. She understood why they asked. From the outside, it probably looked like a disproportionate response to a $4,000 fine. But it had never really been about the money. It had been about a rule that didn't exist, enforced against people who never thought to question it, because questioning it felt like more trouble than it was worth. That was the part she kept coming back to, honestly. Not Dale, not the fine. The silence that had come before her. 4 years of a fabricated rule going unchallenged, because the people it targeted were exactly the kind of people taught to avoid conflict, to pay quietly, to assume that whoever held the clipboard must have the authority to back it up. She didn't think Dale Preston was some rare monster. She thought he was what happened, again and again, in small institutions all over the country, when nobody with the ability to check the paperwork ever bothered to ask. An HOA board, a homeowners association, a neighborhood committee. It was such a small stage for that kind of unchecked power, and that was exactly what made it so common. Nobody thought to investigate a mailbox fine the way they'd investigate something that felt more serious. That was precisely why it worked, for as long as it was allowed to. What actually dismantled it wasn't confrontation in the end. It was documentation. It was patience. It was one recorded document that didn't match one-sided rule, and the willingness to keep asking a simple question until someone in the room finally had to answer it honestly. Her mailbox still stood exactly where her father had built it. Same cast iron, same navy blue, a little more weathered now than it had been 4 months earlier. A small plaque sat beneath it, one her husband had made, 11 words that said everything she'd actually learned from the whole ordeal. Some things are worth keeping exactly as they are. Not because they were valuable, because they were true. And truth was worth protecting even when it was inconvenient. Even when protecting it cost time and comfort, and a few uncomfortable evenings standing alone on a front porch. If there was one thing Marin hoped people would take from her story, it was that unchecked authority, even the small, unglamorous kind, the kind wearing a golf polo and carrying a clipboard, depended entirely on people staying quiet. It only worked as long as nobody asked to see the paperwork. So she hoped they would ask to see the paperwork. Chances are a lot of people watching had their own version of Dale. Maybe it was about a fence, or a paint color, or a garden gnome that meant more than it looked like it should. Viewers were invited to share their own story in the comments below, what their HOA had fined them for, and whether they ever found out if the rule was even real. And for more stories like this one, real disputes, real documentation, real people standing their ground against the small, unchecked powers that hide in ordinary places, subscribing meant there was more where this came from. Some things really were worth fighting for. Sometimes it just took one mailbox to prove it.